Sometimes the hardest journey isn't the miles you walk, but returning to the place where your heart got broken. Tansy Quill had sworn she'd never set foot in that dusty border town again, but here she was, walking down from the mountains with nothing but old memories and newer regrets. She found a young woman collapsed in the street. Lona Wirth hadn't eaten in 3 days. Her lips were cracked, her face was pale, but her eyes still burned with fight. Tansy helped her up and listened to her story. Someone had stolen Lona's family land through fake papers and lies. The homestead that had been in her family for generations was gone. When Lona said the thief's name, Tansy felt her chest tighten. It was someone she had once trusted. What would you do if betrayal came from the last person you expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tansy half-carried Lona down the dusty street toward the boarding house at the edge of town. The girl weighed hardly anything, all bones and determination. Her breath came shallow, and her steps faltered every few paces, but she didn't complain. That told Tansy something important. About her character, the boarding house sat at the corner, where Main Street gave up trying to be impressive and surrendered to the reality of hard dirt and broken promises. Mrs. Calloway ran it, a widow herself who'd learned that asking too many questions was bad for business. She met them at the door with knowing eyes and a neutral expression. "She needs food and a bed," Tansy said, fishing coins from her pocket. "I'll pay for 3 days." Mrs. Calloway looked at Lona's condition and nodded. "Soup first?" "Light broth. Her stomach won't handle much else yet." She was already moving toward the kitchen. "Bring her to the back room. It's quiet there." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out on nothing much. Tansy eased Lona onto the bed and pulled off her worn boots. The girl's feet were blistered and bleeding. 3 days without food meant she'd been walking longer than that, probably a week or more. Mrs. Calloway returned with a bowl of chicken broth and some bread softened in warm milk. "Small bites," she instructed, then left them alone. Tansy watched Lona eat. The girl tried to go slow, but hunger made her hands shake. After the first few spoonfuls, tears started running down her face. She didn't make a sound, just kept eating and crying until the bowl was empty. "More?" Tansy asked. Lona shook her head. "Not yet, Mrs. Calloway is right. My stomach's been empty too long." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Thank you. I don't even know your name." Tansy Quill. Recognition flickered across Lona's features. "The mountain woman. My father spoke of you. He said you could track a whisper across stone." That had been a long time ago, when Tansy's name meant something other than ghost. "Your father knew me?" "He knew of you. Said you guided settlers through the high passes before the railway changed everything." Lona settled back against the thin pillow. "That was before my time. I'm Lona Wirth." The name meant nothing to Tansy, but that didn't surprise her. She'd been gone from this country for 15 years, and in that time, whole families had come and gone. The land was hard on people who didn't understand its ways. "Tell me about your homestead," Tansy said. Lona's eyes went distant. 3 generations of Wirths on that land. My grandfather cleared it, built the first cabin with his own hands. It's valley land near the timberline, good water, good soil. We ran cattle, grew hay, kept chickens. Wasn't much, but it was ours." Her voice hardened. "Was ours. How did you lose it?" "Men came with papers, official-looking documents with seals and signatures. They said my father had signed over the deed in payment of debts." Lona's hands clenched the blanket. "We didn't owe anybody anything. My father was careful about such things. But the papers looked real, and the sheriff said there was nothing he could do." Tansy had heard versions of this story before. The frontier was full of clever men who knew how to make theft look legal. "What did your father do?" "He tried to fight it in court. Spent what little money we had on a lawyer who turned out to be useless or bought off. I never knew which. The judge ruled against us. Said the papers were in order." Lona's voice cracked. "My father died 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know better. He died of a broken spirit. My mother passed 2 years before that. I've got a younger brother, Danny, but he's working a ranch 3 counties over. He doesn't even know what happened yet. Why didn't you tell him?" Shame colored Lona's face. Because I failed to protect what he had a right to inherit. Because I'm the older one, and I should have been smarter, should have seen it coming, should have done something. She turned her face away. I spent the last of our money trying to find proof of the forgery. Went to the county seat, searched records, asked questions. Ran out of money and food 3 days ago. I was walking back when I collapsed. Back where? To the land. Even if I can't live on it, I wanted to see it one more time. Tansy felt something old and familiar stir in her chest. She'd once had land of her own, a life that made sense. It had been stolen from her too, though not with forged papers. The tools of theft came in many forms. You said someone took your land. Who? Lona met her eyes. A man named Vernon Pike. He owns the timber operation up in the mountains now. Has a logging camp and crews cutting the old growth. The paper said he bought our debt and was entitled to the property when we couldn't pay. She swallowed hard. But there was no debt. It was all lies. The name hit Tansy like a physical blow. She must have shown it on her face, because Lona sat up straighter, suddenly alert. You know him. Tansy walked to the window and looked out at the failing light. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of blood and gold. Up there in those highlands, she'd once had everything that mattered. A husband, a home, a future. Vernon Pike had been part of that world. I knew him, she said quietly. A long time ago. Is he as bad as people say? Tansy thought about the young man Vernon had been. Laughing, generous, quick with a story and a drink. He'd sat at their fire, shared their food, called them friends. Her husband James had trusted him completely. So had she. Worse, Tansy said. Because he makes you believe he's something else until it's too late. Lona swung her legs off the bed, wincing at the pain in her feet. Then you understand. You know what it's like to be cheated by someone who smiles while they do it. Tansy didn't answer directly. There were parts of her story she'd never told anyone, wounds too deep to expose to daylight. Rest now. We'll talk more tomorrow. There's nothing more to talk about. I can't fight him. I have no money, no influence, no proof that would stand up in court. Lona's voice carried the weight of defeat. I just wanted to see the land one more time, then I'll go to my brother. At least he can give me work. Do you have the forged deed? I have a copy. Why? I want to see it. Lona reached into her worn satchel and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed and creased from handling. She handed it to Tansy, who moved closer to the window to catch the last of the light. The document looked official enough, legal language, proper seals, signatures in the right places. But Tansy had learned something about papers during her years with James. He'd been careful about documents, meticulous about records. She'd absorbed that knowledge by proximity, learning to spot the small inconsistencies that marked forgery. This deed had them. The signature was too smooth, too practiced. Real signatures carried hesitation, small variations. This one looked like someone had traced a perfect copy. And the date on the seal didn't match the date on the signature line, off by 3 months. This is fake, Tansy said. I know that. But knowing and proving are different things. Tansy folded the paper and handed it back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we'll go to the courthouse and look at the original records. I already did that. They match the forgery. Then we'll look again. Sometimes what matters isn't just what's there, but what patterns emerge when you see multiple documents together. Tansy moved toward the door. I'll be back in the morning. Why are you helping me? Lona's question stopped her at the threshold. Tansy considered several answers and settled on the simplest truth. Because Vernon Pike took something from me once, and I didn't fight back. I've regretted that for 15 years. Maybe it's time to correct that mistake. She left Lona in the small room and made her way down the boarding house stairs. Mrs. Calloway was in the kitchen washing dishes. The girl going to be all right? The older woman asked. Eventually. And you? Tansy paused. I'll be staying a few days myself. Same rate? For you, Tansy Quill, there's no charge. It's good to see you back in town, even if the circumstances aren't happy ones. Mrs. Calloway dried her hands on her apron. I heard the name Vernon Pike mentioned. You're planning something? Just looking into some old business. Old business has a way of becoming new trouble. Mrs. Calloway's expression was grave. "Pike's got influence now. Money, men, connections. He's not the same fellow who used to drink at Henderson's saloon. I'm not the same woman who used to guide settlers through the passes," Tansy said. "People change. Some do. Some just become more of what they always were underneath." Mrs. Calloway returned to her dishes. "Room at the top of the stairs is yours. Breakfast is at dawn." Tansy climbed to the small room that smelled of old wood and lye soap. She set her pack on the floor and pulled out the bundle she'd carried down from the mountains. Inside was James's rifle, cleaned and oiled, ready for use. Beneath it were letters, old correspondence from the years before everything fell apart. She unfolded one letter and read it by lamplight. James's handwriting, strong and confident, discussing a business opportunity with Vernon. The letter was enthusiastic, full of hope about their future. Reading it now, Tansy could see the naivety in every line. James had believed in people too easily, trusted too quickly. She folded the letter and put it away. Tomorrow, she'd take Lona to the courthouse and start asking questions. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember the man James had been, the life they'd built, and the bitter winter day when everything ended. The mountains had taken James. That was the simple truth. But the circumstances that put him out in that winter storm, desperate and alone, trying to trap enough pelts to recover their losses, those circumstances had Vernon Pike's fingerprints all over them. Tansy blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the dying town. Somewhere up in those mountains, Vernon Pike slept in comfort, surrounded by wealth built on stolen land and broken families. Not for much longer, Tansy thought. Not if she had anything to say about it. The courthouse occupied the most substantial building in town. 2 stories of brick and ambition that spoke to grander days when people believed the railroad would bring prosperity. It hadn't, but the building remained as a monument to optimism. Tansy and Lona arrived when the clerk's office opened. The girl's feet were bandaged, and she moved with care, but her eyes had regained their sharpness overnight. Food and rest had restored something essential in her. The clerk was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous disposition. His nameplate read Horace Mendel. He looked up from his ledger as they entered, and Tansy caught the flicker of recognition, followed by unease. "Help you, ladies?" His voice carried false cheer. "We'd like to examine land transfer records," Tansy said. "Specifically, properties transferred to Vernon Pike over the past 10 years. Mendel's unease intensified. "That's a lot of records. Might take some time to gather. We'll wait." He disappeared into the back room, and Tansy heard the sound of drawers opening and closing. He took longer than necessary, and when he returned, his hands shook slightly as he set a stack of documents on the counter. "These are the Pike transactions. You can review them here, but they can't leave the building." Tansy spread the documents across the available surface. Lona moved beside her, and together they began examining each transfer. A pattern emerged quickly. Over the past decade, Vernon Pike had acquired 17 properties in the mountain region. Every transaction followed the same structure: debt claimed, payment demanded, property transferred when payment couldn't be made. "These families," Lona said, pointing to the names. "I knew some of them. The Hendersons had land next to ours. The Pritchards were good people. They didn't have debts any more than we did." Tansy studied the signatures on the transfer documents. They varied in handwriting, but all carried the same too-perfect quality she'd noticed on Lona's forged deed. Whoever had created these forgeries was skilled, but consistent in their method. "Mr. Mendel," Tansy said, without looking up. "Who witnessed these transfers?" The clerk consulted his ledger. Most were witnessed by the sheriff or his deputy. "Standard procedure for property transfers. And the debts, where are the original loan documents?" Mendel shifted his weight. "Those would be held by the lending party." "In this case, Mr. Pike, convenient," Tansy murmured. She pulled out Lona's deed and laid it beside the others. The similarities were unmistakable. "These were all created by the same hand." "I wouldn't know about that," Mendel said quickly. "I just file what comes through proper channels." Tansy looked at him directly. "Do you own property, Mr. Mendel?" "I what?" Simple question. Do you own land? A small plot, yes. Why? I'd recommend you check your deed regularly. Make sure it's still yours. Tansy gathered the documents and restacked them. We'll need copies of these. That will cost. I'll pay. She set coins on the counter. All of them. I want every Pike transfer copied. Mendel looked like he wanted to refuse, but the money was good, and refusing would raise questions he clearly didn't want asked. It'll take until tomorrow. Tomorrow's fine. We'll be back. They left the courthouse and walked down Main Street. The morning sun was burning off the night's coolness, and the town was waking slowly. A few shopkeepers swept their storefronts, and a wagon rattled past carrying supplies. He's scared, Lona said once they were out of earshot. Yes. Scared of Pike? Or scared of what we might discover? Tansy steered them toward the general store. We need supplies. If we're going to do this properly, we'll need to visit some of these families, see if any are willing to talk. They were selecting jerky and hardtack when Tansy caught movement in her peripheral vision. A man had entered the store, well dressed in a dark suit that marked him as someone with money. He browsed the shelves with casual interest, but his attention kept drifting toward them. Tansy pretended not to notice. She completed her purchases and led Lona outside. The man followed at a discreet distance. When they turned down an alley between buildings, he closed the gap. Ladies, a word if you please. Tansy turned to face him. He was middle-aged, with soft hands and calculating eyes. A watch chain glinted at his vest, silver, ornate, distinctive. Something about it triggered a memory, but Tansy couldn't place it immediately. "What can we do for you?" she asked. "I couldn't help but notice you examining certain records at the courthouse. Records pertaining to Mr. Pike's business dealings." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Pike is a prominent citizen. Questions about his affairs can cause unnecessary complications. We're just looking into public records," Lona said. "That's our right. Of course, of course. Still, sometimes it's wiser to let sleeping dogs lie. The past is settled. Moving forward serves everyone better." He reached into his jacket and produced a leather wallet. "Mr. Pike is a generous man. He understands that sometimes people have difficulties. If there are financial concerns, perhaps an arrangement could be reached." Tansy felt anger rising, but kept her voice level. "We're not interested in arrangements." The man's smile faded. "That's unfortunate. Mr. Pike has friends throughout the territory. The Territorial Land Commissioner, for instance. Sheriff's Department. Even a judge or two." He tucked the wallet away. "Pursuing this matter won't end well. Take the advice of someone who knows how things work here." "And what's your name?" Tansy asked. "That's not important. What's important is that you understand your situation. You're looking into matters that have already been settled legally. If you persist, you'll find doors closing. People who might have helped you, suddenly unable or unwilling. That's just how it goes." He turned to leave, and that's when Tansy saw it clearly, the watch chain. Silver links with a distinctive clasp, shaped like a mountain lion. She'd seen that chain before, years ago, hanging from Vernon Pike's vest. He'd been proud of it, said it was custom-made. "Wait," she said. The man stopped. "That's a fine watch chain." He glanced down at it, suddenly wary. "A gift from Vernon Pike." The wariness became alarm. He didn't answer, just walked quickly away. Lona looked at Tansy. "What was that about?" "That was Vernon reminding us he has reach." Tansy watched the man disappear around the corner. "He knows we're asking questions. Probably knew as soon as we walked into the courthouse. Mendel must have sent word, so what do we do?" Tansy thought about the families on those documents. 17 households displaced and scattered. She thought about her own lost home, James's death, the years spent hiding in the mountains from memories too painful to face. "We keep going," she said. "But we need to be smarter about it. Vernon's watching now, which means we need to move carefully." They returned to the boarding house and spread the notes they'd made across Lona's small room. The pattern of thefts painted a clear picture. Vernon had systematically targeted homesteads along the timberline, properties that gave him control of water rights and access to the valuable old-growth forest. Each theft had been executed the same way: fabricated debts, forged documents, legal proceedings that rubber-stamped the transfers. "He's built an empire on this," Lona said, studying the map Tansy had sketched. All these properties connect. He controls the entire mountain approach, which means he controls the timber, the water, and the routes in and out. Tansy sat back. That's worth a fortune if the railroad ever does come through. The man with the watch chain mentioned the Territorial Land Commissioner. If Pike has him in his pocket, no legal challenge will succeed, Tansy nodded slowly. She'd been thinking the same thing. Legal channels were closed to them. The system was designed to protect property rights. But when the documents themselves were fraudulent and the officials were compromised, the law became a weapon against justice rather than a tool for it. Tomorrow we pick up those copies from Mendel, Tansy said. Then we ride up into the mountains. If we can't prove the forgeries through legal channels, we need to find another way. What other way? Tansy looked at James's rifle propped in the corner. We confront Vernon directly. Get him to admit what he's done, preferably in front of witnesses he can't buy off. That's dangerous, yes. Tansy met Lona's eyes. But sometimes danger is the only path left when all the safe roads are blocked. They spent the afternoon preparing for the journey into the mountains. Tansy knew the territory well enough. It had been her home for years, but 15 years changes things. Trails wash out, landmarks fall, and human activity reshapes the wilderness in ways both subtle and profound. At the livery stable, she negotiated with an old man named Garrett, who remembered her from before. His face creased into a gap-toothed smile when he recognized her voice. Tansy Quill, as I live and breathe. Thought you'd gone native up in the high country. Something like that. I need 2 horses, good mountain stock. Garrett's smile faded when he understood her intention. You heading into Pike's territory? We're heading into the mountains. If that happens to be Pike's territory, then he's taken more than he's entitled to. The old man scratched his jaw. Can't argue with that sentiment, but I can worry about my horses. Pike runs rough crews up there. Not the kind of men who respect property that ain't their own. The horses will come back. You have my word. Garrett studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Your word was always good. I'll pick you 2 sturdy mares, sure-footed and patient. You'll need that in the high places. He moved toward the stalls, then paused. You know Pike's got guards on the main approaches. Since he started the big logging operations, he's particular about who comes and goes. I'm not planning to use the main approaches. Figured as much. Still be careful up there. Things have changed since your time. Pike's got men who don't ask questions, just follow orders. And some of those orders aren't fit for decent folk to hear about. They selected gear, while Garrett readied the horses. Tansy chose saddles worn comfortable, saddlebags that would hold supplies without chafing, and bedrolls that would handle the mountain cold. Lona watched and learned, asking questions about each item's purpose. You ever done any real riding? Tansy asked. Around the homestead. Nothing like what you're describing. You'll learn fast or you'll suffer. The mountains don't give second chances to the unprepared. Tansy softened her tone. Your father taught you to shoot, you said? Yes, rifles mostly. Some handgun work. Good. Bring whatever weapons you're comfortable with. I don't expect trouble, but expecting and preparing are different disciplines. At the general store, they added supplies, dried beans, coffee, salt pork, ammunition. The storekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Paulson, packed their goods with practiced efficiency. You're the second person today buying trail supplies, she commented. Other fellow was one of Pike's men, stocking up heavy. Said they're expecting visitors up at the camp. Tansy kept her expression neutral. What kind of visitors? Didn't say, but he bought good whiskey and better tobacco. The kind you serve to important folks. Mrs. Paulson tied off the packages. Just thought you'd want to know, seeing as you're heading that direction. They returned to the boarding house as afternoon faded toward evening. Lona's feet had improved enough for walking, though she'd need another day before attempting a long ride. Tansy used the time to study James's old map of the mountain territory. The map showed the region as it had been 15 years ago, before Vernon's expansion. Small homesteads dotted the foothills, each marked with family names. Most of those names appeared on the courthouse documents as properties. Transferred to Pike, the consolidated holdings formed a continuous block from the timberline down. Through the best grazing land, Mrs. Calloway brought them supper in Lona's, Room, stew with vegetables and fresh bread. She set the tray down and lingered at the door. "You're planning something that's got the whole town talking," she said quietly. "Mendel at the courthouse sent his boy running to Pike's lawyer soon as you left. That lawyer sent a telegram up to the logging camp. By now, Vernon Pike knows exactly what you're doing, and probably where you are. Let him know," Tansy said. "Maybe it'll make him nervous enough to make a mistake, or dangerous enough to make sure you don't come back down from those mountains." Mrs. Calloway's concern was genuine. "I remember what happened to your James, Tansy. I remember how he went up there in winter, desperate and alone. I don't want to remember the same about you." The words hit harder than Tansy expected. She'd spent years not talking about James's death, not examining it too closely, because the pain was too immediate, even after all this time. But Mrs. Calloway was right to invoke his memory. This path she was starting down had echoes of the one that killed her husband. "I'm not alone this time," Tansy said, glancing at Lona. "And I'm not desperate, just determined. Determination and desperation look similar from the outside." Mrs. Calloway moved to leave, then added, "There's a man staying in room 4. Came in this afternoon, paid for 3 nights. He's got the look of someone who watches and reports. Just so you know." After she left, Tansy moved to the window and observed the street below. A man sat on the bench outside the dry goods store, apparently idle, but positioned where he could watch the boarding house entrance. Another lingered near the livery stable. "We're being watched," she told Lona. "Pike's men." "Most likely. He wants to know when we leave and which direction we take." Tansy let the curtain fall back. "Which means we leave in darkness, take the back way out, and head up through the eastern pass. It's rougher, but it'll buy us time before they realize we're gone." They spent the evening checking gear and weapons. Tansy showed Lona how to pack a saddlebag for mountain work. Heavy items low and centered, frequently needed items accessible, nothing that would rattle or shift during rough travel. The work was familiar to Tansy, muscle memory, from years of guiding settlers through difficult country. "Tell me about your husband," Lona said as they worked. "If that's not too personal." Tansy considered deflecting, then decided the girl deserved honesty. "James was a good man. Trusting, maybe too much so. He believed in people's essential decency, thought everyone operated from the same code of fairness he did." She folded a blanket with careful precision. Vernon Pike taught him different, but by the time James understood the lesson, it was too late. Pike cheated him, in every way that matters. Business deal that was supposed to secure our future. Vernon convinced James to invest everything we had, promised returns that would set us up for life. Tansy's hands stilled on the blanket. The deal collapsed. We lost our land, our savings, James's reputation. Vernon walked away clean, claimed he'd lost money too, but somehow he ended up with assets while we had nothing. That's when James went into the mountains. Winter trapping was the only way to earn fast money. I told him to wait until spring, but he was desperate to fix what he saw as his failure. Tansy resumed packing, needing the activity to keep emotion at bay. Storm came in early. He didn't come back. Search party found him 3 weeks later, frozen in a snowbank. He'd been trying to make it back to the cabin, got turned around in the whiteout. Died maybe 2 miles from safety. Lona was quiet for a moment. "And you blame Vernon Pike?" "I blame Vernon for creating the circumstances that put James out there. The storm killed him, but Vernon's betrayal made it necessary for James to be in that storm's path." Tansy met Lona's eyes. "That's why I'm helping you. Not just because your cause is just, but because Vernon Pike has been escaping consequences for his actions long enough. Time someone made him answer for what he's done." They finished packing as full darkness settled outside. Tansy checked the loads in James's rifle and her revolver, both weapons clean and ready. Lona did the same with her father's old Spencer carbine. "We leave 2 hours before dawn," Tansy said. "Get some rest while you can. The trail up the eastern pass is unforgiving, and we'll need to move fast once we're clear of town." But sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Tansy lay in her room, listening to the night sounds, thinking about the mountains that waited in the darkness. Somewhere up there, Vernon Pike lived in comfort built on stolen lives. Tomorrow, that comfort would start to crack. They slipped out of the boarding house 3 hours before dawn, moving through the darkness like shadows. Mrs. Calloway had left the back door unlatched and food wrapped in the kitchen. She didn't appear to see them off, which Tansy appreciated. Goodbyes had a way of feeling final. Garrett met them at the livery stable with 2 sturdy mares already saddled. "Eastern Pass," he said quietly. "Smart choice. Pike's men are watching the main road. Did they ask about us?" "Fellow came by at sunset, wanted to know if anyone had bought horses for mountain travel. I told him a prospector headed out yesterday toward the southern claims." Garrett patted one mare's neck. "These girls will serve you well. The bay's name is Copper, the roan is called Steady. They're both mountain-bred and sensible." Tansy checked the saddle rigging by feel in the darkness. Everything was properly secured. She handed Garrett extra coins. "For your trouble and your discretion. Don't need paying for doing what's right," but he took the money anyway. "There's something you should know. That prospector I mentioned? He was real. Came through 2 days ago heading south. But yesterday evening, some of Pike's men rode out in that direction. Haven't come back yet." The implication hung in the darkness. Tansy felt Lona stiffen beside her. "You think they'd hurt a prospector just to maintain their story?" Lona asked. "I think Pike's men do what they're told, and don't ask philosophical questions." Garrett stepped back. "Watch yourselves up there, and bring my horses back." They rode east through the sleeping town, keeping to the alleys and back ways. A dog barked once, then went silent. The stars overhead were sharp and clear, providing just enough light to navigate by. Tansy led them to the trailhead, a narrow gap between rock formations that marked the beginning of the Eastern Pass. The climb started gradually, winding through scrub pine and juniper. As they gained elevation, the trail steepened, and the vegetation changed to the hardy species that could survive mountain conditions. Dawn caught them 2 hours into the climb, the sun breaking over distant peaks and flooding the world with sudden gold. Tansy called a halt to rest the horses and check their back trail. No signs of pursuit yet, but that didn't mean much. Peake's men would have discovered their absence by now and would be organizing a response. "How long until we reach the timber operations?" Lona asked, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. "If we push hard late afternoon, but we're not going directly there. First we visit the families who lost land. See if any are willing to talk, share what they know." Tansy studied the terrain ahead. "There's a homestead about 3 hours north of here. Henderson family, according to the courthouse records. They lost their place 5 years ago. They continued climbing as the sun warmed the rocks around them. The trail demanded attention. Loose stones, narrow switchbacks, places where one misstep would send horse and rider tumbling into the canyon below. Lona handled it better than Tansy had expected, trusting her mount and learning quickly from observation. By midday, they reached a small valley where a creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The remains of a cabin stood near the water, walls collapsed and roof fallen in. Someone had tried to burn it, but the green timber had resisted complete destruction. "Henderson Place?" Lona asked. Tansy dismounted and examined the ruins. She found the remnants of family life. A broken plate, a child's wooden toy, a rusted horseshoe nailed above where the door had been. The Hendersons had lived here, raised children, built a life. Now it was rubble and memories. "They're long gone," Tansy said. "But someone else is here." She'd spotted smoke rising from behind a stand of aspens, thin and carefully managed. Someone who didn't want to advertise their presence, but needed a fire for cooking. They approached cautiously, hands near weapons. A lean-to stood hidden among the trees, barely visible until they were almost upon it. A family huddled near a small fire, a man, woman, and 3 children, all with the hollow-eyed look of people living on the edge. The man jumped up when he saw them, reaching for a rifle that leaned against a nearby tree. Tansy raised her hands peacefully. "Easy now. We're not with Pike." The man didn't lower the rifle. "Then who are you?" "My name's Tansy Quill. This is Lona Wirth. We're looking into land transfers, trying to understand what Vernon Pike has done." Recognition flickered in the man's face. "Wirth? Your family had the valley property near Eagle Creek." "That's right," Lona said. "Pike took it from us same as he took from you." The man's wife stood slowly, pulling the children close. We're the Hendersons. This was our land until 5 years ago. Now we're squatting in the ruins, hiding like criminals on property that should be ours. Thomas Henderson was gaunt, but still strong, weathered by hard living. His wife Anna looked older than she probably was, worn down by fear and uncertainty. The children, 2 boys and a girl, watched the strangers with wary curiosity. "Tell us what happened," Tansy said. They sat by the small fire while Thomas explained. The story matched Lona's. Men appearing with documents claiming debts, legal proceedings that moved too fast to challenge, a sheriff who shrugged and said his hands were tied. The Hendersons had been ordered off their land with nothing but what they could carry. "We tried going to the territorial capital, filing complaints," Anna said. "Nobody would listen. Pike's got friends in high places, and we're just homesteaders with no proof beyond our word." "Why did you come back?" Lona asked. Thomas stared into the fire. "Because leaving felt like giving up completely. We figured if we stayed close, maybe someday we'd find a way to reclaim what's ours. Foolish, probably, but hope dies hard." "It's not foolish," Tansy said. "And you're not alone anymore. There are at least 17 families in the same situation. If we can prove Pike forged those documents, every one of those transfers becomes invalid." "How do you prove something like that?" Thomas asked. "He's got the original documents probably locked away safe. And even if you got your hands on them, who's going to challenge his version of events? The clerk who filed them? The sheriff who enforced them? They're all complicit." Tansy had been thinking about that problem since leaving town. Legal channels were closed. Official testimony would be compromised or coerced. They needed something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "We need a confession," she said. "Or we need to catch him in the act of doing it again." "Good luck with that," Thomas said bitterly. "Pike's careful. He's been running this scheme for a decade without getting caught. Maybe he's gotten comfortable, thinks he's untouchable." Tansy stood. "Either way, we're going up to his camp. We're going to confront him, and we're going to find a way to expose what he's done." Anna shook her head. "You'll disappear, same as others who've tried. Pike's got men up there who'll do anything he asks. Rough types, the kind who don't mind violence." "I'm counting on that," Tansy said. "Violent men make mistakes. They think force solves everything, which makes them predictable." She looked at Thomas. "If we succeed, if we bring Pike down, would you testify to what happened to your family?" "In a heartbeat. But succeeding is a big if. It always is." Tansy and Lona prepared to leave. Before mounting, Tansy turned back. "Stay hidden for the next few days. If things go wrong up at the camp, Pike might send men to clean up loose ends. Don't be here if that happens." They rode north again, following the creek upstream toward the timberline. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall pines, and the air carried the scent of resin and distant wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, Vernon Pike's operation hummed with activity. Trees falling, crews working, profits accumulating. "You really think we can make him confess?" Lona asked as they rode. "No," Tansy admitted. "But I think we can rattle him enough to make a mistake. And mistakes create opportunities." The trail climbed higher, and the sound of axes on wood echoed through the forest. They heard the logging operation before they saw it. The rhythmic bite of axes, the crack of falling timber, men shouting directions. Tansy led them off the main trail onto a narrow game path that wound through dense undergrowth. From higher ground, they could observe without being observed. Vernon Pike's operation sprawled across a natural clearing that had been expanded by cutting. A large lodge dominated the center, built from the same old-growth timber being harvested around it. Smaller structures surrounded it, bunkhouses for the crews, a cookhouse, storage sheds. Men moved between the buildings with the organized purpose of an established enterprise. "He's built himself a small empire," Lona whispered. Tansy counted at least 20 men visible, though likely more were deeper in the forest cutting timber. Guards stood at strategic points, armed with rifles. This wasn't just a logging camp, it was a fortified position. They retreated deeper into the forest and made camp in a ravine Tansy remembered from her guiding days. A narrow cut in the rock face led to a small cave, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. James had shown it to her on one of their first trips into the high country, called it his secret place. Inside, the cave was dry and sheltered from wind. Tansy found the remains of an old campfire. James's fire, she realized with a pang. Beside it, carved into the rock wall, were their initials inside a rough heart. She traced the letters with her finger, remembering the young woman who'd watched her husband carve them, believing their future was as permanent as stone. "You all right?" Lona asked softly. "Just ghosts." Tansy turned away from the carving. "We'll rest here for an hour, then scout closer once the light starts failing. Men are less vigilant at dusk, tired from the day's work and thinking about supper. They ate cold rations and tended the horses." Lona checked her carbine, working the action repeatedly until satisfied it moved smoothly. Tansy watched her, seeing the same methodical care James had taught her about weapons. They weren't toys or threats, but tools that demanded respect and proper maintenance. "Your father taught you well," Tansy observed. "He said a gun that doesn't work when you need it might as well be a club. And there are better clubs." Lona ran an oiled cloth along the barrel. He was particular about such things. Particular about everything, really. Kept precise records, measured twice before cutting once. Said shortcuts just meant doing things twice. That kind of man doesn't take on debt carelessly. That's what made the papers so ridiculous. My father wouldn't have borrowed money without telling the family. Wouldn't have signed anything without reading every word 3 times. Lona's jaw tightened. The forged signature wasn't even close to his real one. The sheriff looked at it for about 5 seconds before saying it looked legitimate enough. Didn't want to look closer, didn't want to question it. Tansy pulled James's old map from her saddlebag and spread it on the cave floor. By lamplight, she compared it to the mental notes she'd made while observing the camp. Vernon had indeed consolidated the entire mountain approach, controlling access to the timber and water. "This much land," Tansy said, tracing the boundaries, "represents more than just logging profits. Control of water rights alone makes it valuable. And if the railroad ever does come through, he'd be positioned to sell at enormous profit," Lona finished. "Or demand passage fees from anyone who needs to cross his property." "Exactly. This isn't just theft for immediate gain. It's long-term strategy." Tansy studied the map more carefully. "And there's something else. See how all these properties form a corridor? They connect the high timber to the valley routes. Anyone wanting to move lumber from the mountains to market would have to go through Vernon's land or take a route 3 times as long. So he's created a monopoly. More than that, he's created a choke point. And whoever controls choke points controls commerce." Tansy rolled up the map. "No wonder he's got powerful friends. Men with interests in regional development would want Vernon's cooperation." As twilight settled, they worked their way closer to the camp. Tansy moved with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent years in wilderness, teaching Lona through gesture and example how to avoid dry branches and loose stones. They reached a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view into the camp. The evening meal was underway. Men gathered at long tables outside the cookhouse, eating and talking. Vernon Pike emerged from the main lodge, and Tansy got her first clear look at him in 15 years. He'd aged harder than she had. His hair had gone mostly grey, and his face carried deep lines, but he moved with confidence that came from power. He walked among his men like a landowner inspecting his holdings, commenting occasionally, receiving deference from everyone he addressed. "That's him?" Lona asked. "That's Vernon." They watched him interact with his crew. He seemed affable enough, even laughing at something one man said. But Tansy caught the undertone of control. Men stepped aside when he approached. Conversations quieted when he passed. Eyes tracked his movements. This wasn't camaraderie. This was fear dressed up as respect. A rider approached from the south trail, dismounting quickly and heading straight for Vernon. They spoke briefly, too far away for words to carry, but the rider's urgency was clear. Vernon's posture changed, shoulders tightening. He issued sharp orders, and several men hurried to saddle horses. "They know we're here," Tansy said. "How?" "Could be they found our trail, or maybe someone down in town sent word faster than we expected." Tansy watched the men prepare to ride. Either way, they're organizing a search. They withdrew quietly, returning to their cave as full darkness descended. Inside, Tansy considered their options. Vernon knew someone was poking around his operation. He'd send men to find them, probably assuming they'd be easy prey. A couple of women who didn't understand the danger they were in. That assumption could be useful. "We need something from inside that camp," Tansy said, making a decision. "Vernon keeps records, probably including the original forged deeds. Thomas Henderson mentioned that, said Vernon keeps insurance on people who helped him. You want to break into his lodge? Not tonight, but soon. If we can get those documents." A sound outside the cave made them both freeze. Footsteps on rock, careful but not careful enough. Someone was approaching the cave entrance. Tansy raised her rifle, sighting on the opening. Lona moved to the side, carbine ready. The footsteps came closer, then stopped just outside. "Don't shoot," a voice called softly. "I'm alone, and I'm not with Pike." "Show yourself," Tansy ordered. "Slow and with your hands visible." A young man stepped into the cave mouth, hands raised. He was thin, maybe 20 years old, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. His clothes marked him as one of the logging crew, but his eyes carried something different from what Tansy had seen in the men at camp, fear mixed with determination. "Who are you?" Tansy kept the rifle trained on him. "My name's Thomas. I work for Pike, or I did until about an hour ago." He lowered his hands slowly. "I saw you watching the camp. When Pike sent men out to search, I volunteered so I could warn you." "Why would you do that?" "Because I know what Pike does. I've seen the documents he keeps in his office. I know about the forged deeds, the families he destroyed." Thomas's voice shook slightly. "And yesterday I heard him ordering men to handle the Henderson family if they were still squatting on his land." "Handle them permanently?" Lona drew a sharp breath. Tansy's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. "You have proof of this?" Thomas reached into his jacket carefully, producing a folded paper. "I took this from Pike's office yesterday. It's a page from his ledger showing payments to the county clerk, the sheriff, and others. Proof that he bought their cooperation." Tansy gestured for him to bring it closer. By lamplight, she examined the paper. It was exactly what Thomas claimed, a meticulous record of bribes paid over several years, with names, amounts, and dates. "Why are you giving us this?" "Because I'm tired of being part of something wrong. Because my own family lost land to a similar scheme back in Missouri, and I know what it does to people." Thomas sat heavily on a rock. "And because Pike's planning something bigger. He's expecting visitors in 2 days, important men from the territorial capital and a railroad representative. I heard him telling his foreman to make sure everything looks legitimate, to hide anything that might raise questions." Tansy and Lona exchanged glances. "This changed everything. If we could get into Pike's office during that meeting," Lona said slowly, "while he's distracted with his visitors, we could get the original documents," Tansy finished. "The physical evidence that proves the pattern of fraud," Thomas nodded. "The safe is old but solid. You'd need someone who knows locks, or the combination." "I know locks," Tansy said. "My father was a locksmith before we came west. Taught me the trade before I took up guiding." She looked at Thomas carefully. "But helping us means burning your bridges with Pike. You understand that?" "I understood that when I walked away from camp tonight. There's no going back now." Thomas met her eyes steadily. "I want to help make this right. Whatever that takes." Tansy lowered her rifle completely. "Then welcome to the conspiracy. We've got 2 days to plan a raid on Vernon Pike's stronghold. Let's make sure we do it right." Thomas proved valuable immediately. He knew the camp's routines, the guard rotations, which men were loyal to Pike and which were just there for wages. More importantly, he knew the layout of Pike's lodge, including the location of the safe. "It's in his office, behind a painting of some mountain scene," Thomas explained, sketching a rough diagram in the dirt. "Old combination lock, 3 numbers. Pike opens it at least once a day, usually in the morning after breakfast." "Has he ever opened it with anyone watching?" Tansy asked. "Not that I've seen." "He's careful about that." Thomas added details to his sketch. "But the door to his office doesn't lock properly. The frame warped last winter and he never had it fixed. Said he didn't need locks when he had armed men. They spent the next day observing the camp from different vantage points. Thomas moved freely during daylight, returning to camp to maintain his cover. Pike's men were searching the forest, but they expected to find someone hiding, not someone who'd already infiltrated their ranks. Lona proved herself capable during the reconnaissance. She moved quietly, observed patiently, and asked smart questions about what they were seeing. Tansy watched her transform from the starving girl in the street to someone competent and purposeful. Adversity had that effect on people. It either broke them or forged them into something harder. By evening, Thomas returned with news. The visitors arrived tomorrow afternoon. Pike's having a formal dinner, wants everything to look prosperous and legitimate. Most of the men will be sent to the far cutting sites during the meeting. Keep them out of sight. Only his trusted people will be around the lodge. How many trusted people? Tansy asked 6, maybe 8. But they'll be focused on security outside, making sure no one interrupts the meeting. Thomas pulled the ledger page from his pocket. There's more. I managed to copy some names from other documents while Pike was at the cutting sites today. Families who lost land, dates of transfers, amounts Pike claims they owed. He handed over several pieces of paper covered in careful handwriting. Tansy studied them by firelight. The pattern was even clearer now. Pike had been systematically acquiring properties for a decade, always using the same method. Always targeting families without the resources to fight back legally. This is good work, Tansy said. But we still need the originals. Copies won't stand up in court, not when Pike can claim forgery. I know, but I thought having the information might help somehow. Thomas hesitated. There's something else. I overheard Pike talking with his foreman about the Henderson family. He's sending men tomorrow to burn what's left of their cabin, make sure they move on permanently. Lona stiffened. We need to warn them. Already done, Thomas said. I rode past their camp on my way here and told them to clear out for a few days. They were grateful for the warning. Tansy felt a measure of respect for the young man. He was taking significant risks without being asked, doing what was right despite the danger. That kind of character was rare. Tomorrow's going to be complicated, Tansy said, thinking through the logistics. Pike will be on high alert with important visitors. His men will be watching for anything unusual, which might work in our favor, Lona suggested. They'll be watching for external threats, not internal problems. What are you thinking? Thomas goes back to camp like normal. During the dinner meeting, he finds a way to get into Pike's office from inside. We create a distraction outside that draws attention away from the lodge. Lona looked between them. It's risky, but it splits their focus. Thomas nodded slowly. I could do that. Tell them I forgot tools or need something from the supply shed. Pike's office shares a wall with the storage room. If I'm quick— No, Tansy interrupted. Too dangerous. If Pike catches you in his office, you won't leave that camp alive. Then what do you suggest? Thomas asked. We need those documents, and tomorrow might be our only chance. Once Pike completes whatever deal he's making with these visitors, he'll be even more untouchable. Tansy studied the crude map Thomas had drawn. The lodge had multiple entry points, but most were visible from the guard positions. Except she noticed something Thomas had sketched without emphasis. This window here on the east side. What room is that? Storage room? Where they keep spare tools, equipment, supplies, and you said it shares a wall with Pike's office. Yes, thin wall, just planking. You can hear conversations through it if you're quiet. Tansy traced a path with her finger. The east side backs up to the tree line. With the guards focused on the main approaches and the formal areas, someone could reach that window without being seen. Someone small and quiet, Lona said, understanding. Like me? No. Too dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous, Lona countered. But I'm smaller than you, can move faster, and I've got more to lose. That was my family's land Pike stole. Let me do this. Tansy wanted to refuse, to keep the girl out of direct danger. But Lona was right. She was better suited for this particular task. And they couldn't afford to let caution prevent them from acting when opportunity presented itself. If we do this, Tansy said carefully, we plan it down to the smallest detail. Nothing left to chance. And we have multiple escape routes. They spent the rest of the evening planning. Thomas would return to camp and position himself to help if needed. He'd find reasons to be near the storage room. ready to assist Lona from inside if she ran into trouble. Tansy would create a distraction on the west side of camp, something that drew guards away but didn't trigger full alarm. Fire? Thomas suggested. Something in the woodpile, controlled but concerning. Too risky. Fire in a logging camp could spread out of control. Tansy thought about the horses she'd seen in the corral. What if some of those horses got loose? Take time to round them up, create movement and confusion. That could work, Lona agreed. Especially if it happens right as dinner is being served. Men will be focused on food, won't want to leave it to chase horses. They refined the plan until everyone knew their role. Thomas would leave before dawn, return to camp with a story about tracking them unsuccessfully. Tansy and Lona would move into position during the afternoon, waiting for the visitors to arrive and the dinner to begin. One more thing, Thomas said as he prepared to leave. Pike's been wearing a gun lately. He didn't used to, but the last few days he's kept a revolver on his hip. He's nervous about something. About us, Tansy said. He knows someone's asking questions, poking at his operation. He just doesn't know who yet or what we're planning. After Thomas left, Tansy and Lona checked their weapons one final time. The rifle, the carbine, revolvers for backup. Tansy hoped they wouldn't need any of it, that they could get in and out without violence. But hope and planning were different things, and she'd learned long ago to plan for the worst. You don't have to do this, Tansy said to Lona. We could find another way. There is no other way. Not one that works in time, Lona met her eyes steadily. My father died because he couldn't fight back against Pike's lies. My family lost everything. If I walk away now, all of that was for nothing. I need to do this. Not just for me, but for everyone Pike has hurt. Tansy recognized that determination. She'd felt it herself when she decided to come down from the mountains and face the past she'd been avoiding. Some things couldn't be outrun or ignored. Sometimes the only path forward led straight through the fire. Then we do it right, Tansy said. We do it smart, we do it careful, and we all come back alive. Agreed? Agreed. They settled in to wait for dawn, both knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate their efforts or end them. In the darkness of the cave, with James's carved initials barely visible on the wall, Tansy allowed herself to hope that maybe finally justice would find Vernon Pike. The visitors arrived in mid-afternoon, their wagons announcing importance with polished wood and brass fittings. Tansy watched from the tree line as Vernon Pike emerged from his lodge to greet them, two men in formal suits, looking uncomfortable in the rough setting. That's the Territorial Land Commissioner, Thomas had whispered before leaving. The man with the silver beard. The other one represents the railroad company. Now, watching Pike play the gracious host, Tansy felt her hatred sharpen. He moved among these men like an equal, shaking hands and gesturing toward his operation with obvious pride. To them, he was a successful businessman. They didn't see the families destroyed, the forged documents, the systematic theft. Lona crouched beside her, tense and ready. They'd spent the afternoon moving into position, working their way to the eastern edge of the camp, where trees grew close to the buildings. The storage room window was barely visible through the foliage, just as Thomas had described. Once they're inside for dinner, we move, Tansy said quietly. You go for the window. I'll wait 15 minutes, then spook the horses. That gives you time to get in and locate the safe. What if I can't open it? Then you get out fast. We'll find another way. Tansy gripped Lona's shoulder. But if you do get it open, grab everything inside. Don't sort through it, just take it all. Speed matters more than selection. The men disappeared into the lodge. Through the windows, Tansy could see them settling into what looked like a formal dining room. Servants, Pike's men dressed for the occasion, began bringing food. The dinner would last at least an hour, maybe more if business discussions ran long. Tansy checked her watch, an old piece that had belonged to James. 6 o'clock. Full darkness wouldn't come for another 2 hours. But twilight would provide enough shadow for their purposes. Go, she said to Lona, and be careful. Lona moved through the trees like smoke, using every bit of cover. Tansy watched her reach the wall of the lodge and work on the window. It resisted at first, swollen in its frame, but Lona's persistence paid off. The window opened, and she slipped inside, disappearing from view. Tansy counted slowly, giving Lona time to orient herself in the dark storage room and find the door to Pike's office. At the 15-minute mark, she moved toward the horse corral on the west side of camp. Two guards stood talking near the cookhouse, but their attention was on the lodge where their boss entertained important guests. The corral gate had a simple latch. Tansy opened it quietly, then picked up several stones. She threw them hard against the far side of the nearest building, creating sharp cracks that spooked the horses. They bolted through the open gate, scattering across the camp. Shouts erupted immediately. Men poured from the bunkhouses, and the guards abandoned their posts to chase the panicked animals. Tansy used the chaos to move closer to the lodge's east side, positioning herself where she could see the storage room window. Inside the lodge, Lona worked in near darkness. The storage room was cluttered with tools and supplies, but she found the door that Thomas had described. It opened into a narrow hallway, and across that hallway was Pike's office. The office door was unlocked, as Thomas had promised. Lona slipped inside and closed it quietly behind her. The room was larger than she expected. A substantial desk, filing cabinets, and on the wall a painting of mountains at sunset. She moved to the painting and lifted it carefully. The safe was there, exactly where Thomas had said it would be. Old solid, with a 3-number combination lock. Lona put her ear to it, trying to remember what her father had once told her about listening for tumblers. But she'd never actually done it, and the safe was well made. She was about to give up when she noticed something on Pike's desk, a leather journal open to a page of notes. Most were business figures, but in the margin someone had written 3 numbers, 1532-7, worth a try. Lona turned the dial carefully. 15 right, 32 left, 7 right. The safe clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, deeds, contracts, letters. Lona began pulling them out, stuffing them into the canvas bag she'd brought. Her hands shook with adrenaline, making her clumsy. Papers scattered on the floor. That's when she saw it, a daguerreotype photograph in a silver frame. 3 young men, with arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. She recognized Vernon Pike immediately, younger but unmistakable. Next to him stood another man, handsome and confident, James Quill, she realized, recognizing him from Tansy's descriptions, but it was the third man who made her freeze. She'd seen his face just hours ago, stepping out of a wagon and greeting Vernon Pike, the Territorial Land Commissioner, the man currently eating dinner in the next room. Lona picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Behind it was a letter, the paper yellowed with age. She unfolded it enough to read the salutation, "Dear Vernon," and the signature at the bottom, "James Quill." She shouldn't read it. She needed to grab everything and go. But the date on the letter caught her eye. December 1870, more than 15 years ago. And the content, she couldn't help skimming the words. "The arrangement we discussed with Charles is sound. The consolidation will take time, but once we control the mountain approaches, the railroad will have no choice but to negotiate on our terms. I've identified 6 properties that represent strategic positions. With Charles's help at the land office, we can facilitate the transfers." Lona felt sick. James Quill, Tansy's husband, the man she'd mourned and defended, had been part of the scheme from the beginning. Not a victim of Vernon Pike's betrayal, but a partner in planning the systematic theft of land. She forced herself to keep reading. The letter outlined a detailed plan to acquire properties through manufactured debts and forged documents. James had even suggested specific families to target, noting which ones lacked the resources to fight back legally. But then the tone shifted. A later paragraph was crossed out heavily, but still partially legible. "I'm having second thoughts about this course of action. The Martinez family has children, and the thought of displacing them troubles my conscience. Perhaps we should reconsider." The rest was obliterated by black ink, as if someone had intentionally obscured James's doubts. Footsteps in the hallway snapped Lona back to immediate danger. She shoved the photograph and letter into her bag, along with the other documents, and turned toward the door, just as it opened. Vernon Pike stood in the doorway, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a revolver in the other. His face registered surprise for only a moment before hardening into cold fury. "Well now," he said quietly, "this is unexpected. A girl breaks into my office during dinner. Bold, I'll give you that." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You're the Wirth girl. I recognize you from the property transfer. You look like your father." Lona said nothing, calculating distances and options. The window was behind Pike. The office had no other exit. "Looking for something specific?" Pike gestured at the open safe with his glass. "Or just taking whatever you could carry?" "I'm looking for justice," Lona said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "For my family and all the others you destroyed." Pike laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Justice? You mean those documents? Papers that show business transactions, all perfectly legal and properly recorded?" He took a sip of whiskey. "Even if you got out of here with them, which you won't, they prove nothing except that I'm a successful businessman. They prove you forged debts that didn't exist. They prove you stole land from families who had no way to fight back. They prove I'm smart enough to understand how the system works. Property rights, debt collection, legal transfers, all within the bounds of territorial law." Pike's eyes were cold. "Your father signed those papers. You saw his signature." "That wasn't his signature. It was a forgery. Prove it." "Oh, wait, you can't, because your father's dead, and dead men don't testify in court." Pike raised the revolver slightly. "Now drop the bag, and we'll discuss what to do with you." Lona's hand moved toward her coat, where her revolver was holstered. Pike saw the movement and shook his head. "Don't. I'm a good shot, and at this range I won't miss." He gestured with the gun. "Slowly now. Drop the bag and take your hand away from that coat." Outside, Tansy had noticed something wrong. Lona should have been back by now. The chaos with the horses was dying down, men were returning to positions, and the window to the storage room was still open, but empty. Then she saw Pike leaving the dining room, moving toward the office wing with purpose. He'd noticed something, or someone had alerted him. Either way, Lona was in immediate danger. Tansy moved without thinking, circling toward the lodge's main entrance. She couldn't use the storage room window, too exposed now with men returning to their posts. But the front door was unlocked, left open in the confusion with the horses. She slipped inside and moved through the lodge toward Pike's office, rifle ready. She could hear voices, Pike's low and threatening, Lona's defiant. The office door was closed but not latched. Tansy pushed it open with the rifle barrel. "Vernon," she said quietly. "It's been a long time." Pike spun toward her, and for just a moment his composure cracked. He stared at her like she was a ghost risen from the grave. "Tansy Quill," he whispered. "James said you died. Winter fever up in the mountains. James said a lot of things. Not all of them were true." Tansy kept the rifle trained on him. "Lower your weapon. Whatever else happens, you won't shoot that girl." "You have no idea what's happening here," Pike said, but his gun hand lowered slightly. "This is business." James understood that. He was part of it from the start. "I know. I've seen the letter." Tansy's voice was steady, despite the pain those words caused. "But James had second thoughts. That's why you destroyed him. That's why you made sure he died in those mountains." Pike's expression shifted to something like regret. James was weak. He developed a conscience at exactly the wrong time. I tried to help him, tried to make him see reason, but he wouldn't listen. Said he was going to expose everything, ruin all of us. The regret disappeared, replaced by hardness. So, yes, I made sure he had no choice but to head into the mountains that winter. Made sure he was desperate enough to risk it. The storm did the rest. Tansy had suspected as much for 15 years. Having it confirmed still hit like a physical blow. "You killed him." "I let nature take its course." "There's a difference." "Not to me." Tansy advanced a step, the rifle never wavering. "Lona, get the documents and go." But Lona held up the photograph and letter instead. "You need to see this first, Tansy. You need to know the whole truth before we leave." Tansy took the photograph and letter from Lona without lowering her rifle. She didn't need to read the full letter. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. James hadn't been Vernon's victim. He'd been his partner. "He planned it all with you," Tansy said, her voice hollow. "The land scheme, the forgeries, everything." "Not everything," Vernon replied, seeming to gain confidence from her shock. "James had the vision. He understood how controlling the mountain approaches would position us when the railroad came through. Charles, the commissioner you saw at dinner, had the access to make transfers look legitimate. I had the capital and the will to see it through." He smiled without warmth. "James contributed the brilliance, but he lacked the stomach for what brilliance requires. He tried to stop you. Too late. After we'd already taken 4 properties, displaced 3 families. His conscience kicked in when it was inconvenient." Vernon's voice hardened. "He threatened to expose us, to turn himself in and drag Charles and me down with him. Said he couldn't live with what we'd done, so you made sure he didn't live at all. I gave him a choice. Keep quiet, rebuild his life somewhere else, and I'd make sure he was taken care of financially, or persist in his moral crusade and lose everything. Reputation, freedom, you." Vernon's eyes locked on Tansy's. He chose the crusade. What happened after was his own fault. Tansy felt something inside her, breaking apart and reforming into something harder. The man she'd loved, mourned, and built her identity around for 15 years, had been complicit in the same crimes that now motivated her. Every family Vernon had destroyed, James had helped destroy, including indirectly his own. "The Martinez family," Lona said quietly, reading from the letter. "James mentioned them specifically, that he had second thoughts about displacing them." "The Martinez homestead was valuable," Vernon said. "Good water, access to the timber. James got sentimental because they had children. I told him we weren't in the business of sentimentality." He gestured at the documents scattered around Lona's feet. "All of those families, they were in the way of progress. Someone was going to consolidate that land eventually. We just had the foresight to do it ourselves." Through the office door, Tansy could hear voices from the dining room. The territorial commissioner and the railroad representative were still there, probably wondering where their host had gone. Guards would be returning to their posts. Their window of opportunity was closing. "We're leaving," Tansy said, "with the documents. You're going to let us walk out of here, and you're not going to raise an alarm until we're clear." Vernon laughed. "You think you can threaten me in my own camp, surrounded by my men? Even if you shoot me, which I don't think you have the spine for, you'll never make it out alive. Maybe not. But your dinner guests will hear the shot. They'll come running and see what's in that safe. See the documents proving you built your empire on forgery and theft." Tansy stepped closer. "Charles will be implicated. The railroad deal will collapse. Everything you've worked for will unravel. Is that worth dying for?" Vernon's jaw clenched. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Then he smiled, cold and calculating. "You're bluffing. If you fire that rifle, my men will be here in seconds. You might get out, might even make it to the trees. But I have 20 men who know these mountains, who can track and hunt. You'll be found." He raised his voice slightly. "And when you are, the documents will be recovered. But the Wirth girl here, well, accidents happen in the wilderness. So do betrayals," said a voice from the doorway. Thomas stood there, holding a revolver that trembled slightly in his grip. But his eyes were steady. "I heard everything, Mr. Pike, about the Martinez family, about James Quill, about all of it, and I'm done being part of your operation." Vernon's expression shifted from confidence to fury. "You ungrateful! I gave you work when you had nothing. You gave me complicity in theft. There's a difference." Thomas moved into the room. "Let them go, or I tell the commissioner everything I've heard and seen working here. I tell him about the ledger payments, the forged documents, the families you've threatened. Your word against mine, boy. Who do you think they'll believe?" "Maybe neither of us," Thomas admitted, "but it'll raise enough questions to derail your railroad deal. And that's enough." The standoff stretched taut as wire. 4 people in a small office, 3 of them armed, all calculating odds and consequences. Outside, the chaos with the horses had settled. Men were returning to routine. Soon someone would come looking for Pike. Vernon must have reached the same conclusion. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if accepting defeat. Fine. Take the papers. Take your moral victory. It won't matter in the long run. I have copies, I have connections, and I have time. He lowered his revolver completely. But understand this. You've made an enemy today, the three of you. I don't forget that. Neither do I, Tansy said. She gestured to Lona. Get the rest of the documents, everything in that safe. Lona quickly gathered the remaining papers, stuffing them into her bag. The photograph and James's letter went in last. When the safe was empty, she stepped back toward the door. Thomas, you come with us, Tansy said. You can't stay here now. The young man nodded, keeping his gun trained on Vernon. I know. I figured that the moment I walked into this room. They began backing toward the door, Tansy's rifle still aimed at Vernon's chest. He stood motionless, watching them with cold hatred, but something in his posture made Tansy uneasy. He'd given in too easily, accepted defeat too completely. Move, she said to Lona and Thomas. Fast! They slipped into the hallway just as footsteps approached from the dining room. A man in a servant's vest appeared, carrying a wine bottle. He saw them and froze. Mr. Pike, he called uncertainly. Handle it, Tansy hissed at Thomas. Thomas stepped forward, forcing casualness into his voice. Pike's handling some business. He'll be back shortly. To sell the lie, he added, says to serve dessert without him. The servant hesitated, then nodded, and returned to the dining room. But the interruption had cost them seconds they couldn't afford. From the office behind them, Tansy heard Vernon moving. Go! She shouted, abandoning stealth. They ran through the lodge toward the storage room, the route they'd planned as an escape. Behind them, Vernon's voice rose in alarm, calling for his men. Doors burst open throughout the building as guards responded. The storage room window was still open. Lona went through first, landing in the dirt outside and immediately running for the tree line. Thomas followed, less gracefully but with equal urgency. Tansy climbed through last, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet tear into her back. Gunshots cracked through the evening air, but they were firing blind in the fading light. Tansy reached the trees and dove into cover as bark exploded from a trunk beside her head. Ahead, she could see Lona and Thomas scrambling up the slope toward where they'd left the horses. More men poured from the bunkhouses, responding to Vernon's shouts. Lanterns appeared, creating dancing circles of light as guards spread out to search. The camp was transforming into a hunting party with practiced efficiency. Tansy caught up with Lona and Thomas at the horses. Mount up, she ordered, swinging into her saddle. We head north, use the darkness to lose them in the timber. They know these woods, Thomas panted, struggling onto his borrowed horse. They'll track us, not if we're smart about it. Tansy spurred her horse forward, leading them away from the camp at an angle that would make pursuit difficult. And not if we use every trick I learned guiding through these mountains. Behind them, the sounds of organized pursuit grew. Men shouting coordinates, horses being saddled, torches being lit. Vernon Pike's operation was mobilizing with military precision. They had minutes at best before the manhunt began in earnest. The forest was dark now, the last light bleeding from the sky. Tansy navigated by memory and instinct, finding old trails she'd used years ago. The horses struggled with the terrain, but mountain-bred stock knew how to handle uncertain footing. After 20 minutes of hard riding, Tansy called a halt in a dense thicket of pine. Dismount, she whispered. We walk from here, lead the horses. Our trail needs to be invisible. She pulled moss and pine branches to sweep their tracks, an old trick that wouldn't fool expert trackers in daylight, but might work in darkness. Thomas followed her example while Lona scouted ahead for the best route. There's a creek about 100 yards north, Lona reported. I can hear it. Good, we'll use the water to break our trail. Tansy finished obscuring their path and moved forward. Once we're in the creek, we follow it downstream for at least a mile before cutting back into the forest. Water hides scent and tracks. They reached the creek and waded in, the icy water immediately soaking through their boots. The horses balked but followed with gentle urging. Behind them, in the distance, torchlight flickered through the trees like angry fireflies. "They're spreading out," Thomas observed, "trying to find which direction we went." "They'll find it eventually," Tansy said. "Vernon's got good trackers. But eventually buys us time, and time is what we need." They moved through the creek in silence, the water covering any sound of their passage. Fish scattered before them, startled by the intrusion. An owl called from somewhere overhead, hunting in the darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Tansy led them out of the creek and back into the forest on the opposite bank. She'd chosen a rocky section where hoofprints would be minimal, and they moved across bare stone before entering the trees again. "Where are we going?" Lona asked quietly. "There's an old mining camp about 5 miles northeast. Abandoned for years, but the structures might still be standing. We can rest there, check the documents, and plan our next move." Tansy glanced back the way they'd come. "No torchlight visible yet. We need to reach the territorial capital, get these documents to someone who can act on them." "The federal marshal you mentioned?" Thomas asked. "Marshal Samuel Grant. He knew James, knows me, and more importantly, he's been investigating territorial corruption for years. If anyone can use these documents to bring down Vernon and his accomplices, it's him." They continued through the darkness, navigating by starlight and Tansy's knowledge of the terrain. Every snap of a branch made them freeze. Every distant sound could be pursuit closing in. But the mountains that had once taken everything from Tansy now offered sanctuary. She knew their secrets, their hiding places, their paths that existed only for those who understood them. Vernon Pike had built his empire in these highlands, but Tansy had lived here, bled here, lost everything here. The mountains remembered her in ways they would never remember him. "Keep moving," she said softly. "We're not safe yet, but we're not beaten either." The bag of documents hung heavy on Lona's shoulder, proof of systematic theft, evidence of conspiracy, and the painful truth about James Quill's role in it all. Whatever happened next, whatever they had to endure to reach the capital, those papers represented the possibility of justice, or at least the possibility of truth. In the darkness behind them, Vernon Pike's men continued their search, torches spreading through the forest like a slow fire. But for now, in this moment, the 3 fugitives were free and moving toward something that might be hope. The abandoned mining camp materialized from the darkness like a ghost, 3 collapsed structures, and a shaft entrance that yawned black against the hillside. Tansy approached cautiously, checking for recent signs of habitation. The place had been deserted long enough that nature was reclaiming it. Vines growing through broken boards and saplings pushing up through old foundations. "We'll risk a small fire in the old assay office," Tansy said, pointing to the most intact building. "The walls will hide the light, and we need to see what we've got." They led the horses into the shelter of the building and unsaddled them. Thomas found a relatively clear corner and built a tiny fire with dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. By its light, they spread the documents across the dirt floor. There were 17 original deeds, each showing transfer to Vernon Pike. Supporting documents included fabricated loan agreements, forged promissory notes, and correspondence between Vernon and various officials. The ledger page Thomas had stolen earlier showed systematic bribery, payments to clerks, sheriffs, and judges over nearly a decade. "This is enough," Lona said, organizing the papers. "This proves the pattern, shows the conspiracy." "Maybe." Tansy studied James's letter again, unable to avoid it despite the pain it caused. The words were clear. Her husband had not only participated in the scheme, but had helped design it. His change of heart came late, after families had already been destroyed. But Vernon's right about one thing. He has resources and connections. Even with this evidence, the legal battle will be hard. "The railroad representative," Thomas said suddenly. "He was at dinner, witnessed nothing wrong. If the deal goes through before we can expose Vernon, it won't matter what these documents prove. Vernon will be legitimate, protected by corporate interests." Tansy had been thinking the same thing. "How long until that deal is finalized?" They were discussing terms at dinner. My guess is they'll sign preliminary agreements tomorrow, full contract within a week. Thomas poked at the fire. Once the railroad is invested, they'll protect Vernon to protect their own interests. Then we have less than a day to reach the capital and get these documents to Marshal Grant. Tansy calculated distances. It's a hard 2-day ride under normal circumstances. We'd have to push the horses beyond safe limits. Vernon's men are between us and the direct route, Lona pointed out. We'd have to go around at least half a day. They sat in discouraged silence. The documents they'd risked everything to obtain might not matter if they couldn't deliver them in time. And even if they did reach Marshal Grant, would he act quickly enough? Territorial justice moved slowly, especially when powerful interests were involved. A sound outside froze them all. Hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching from the south. Tansy kicked dirt over the fire, plunging them into darkness. They grabbed their weapons and moved to positions near the walls where they could see out through gaps in the boards. 6 riders emerged from the tree line, torches held high. Even in the flickering light, Tansy recognized the lead rider, Vernon Pike himself, sitting tall in his saddle, clearly determined to oversee the hunt personally. Spread out, Vernon ordered. Check every structure. They're tired and desperate. They'll have holed up somewhere close. The riders dismounted and began searching systematically. 2 men approached the assay office where Tansy and the others hid. The horses nickered softly, betraying their presence. There was no way to hide now, no clever escape. We're trapped, Thomas whispered. Tansy's mind raced through options. They could fight, but 6 against 3 with limited ammunition and no cover meant certain death. They could surrender, but Vernon wouldn't let them live, not with what they knew and what they'd stolen. They could run, but the horses were exhausted and wouldn't outpace fresh mounts. Then she remembered the mine shaft. The entrance was 20 feet from the building, a black hole leading into the mountain. Dangerous, possibly collapsed, definitely unstable. But it was the only option that wasn't certain death. The mine, she hissed. It's our only chance. Those old shafts are death traps, Thomas protested. Cave-ins, bad air, vertical drops, better than what's coming through that door. Tansy gathered the documents. Lona, you lead the horses. Thomas, cover our rear. Move now, quiet as you can. They slipped out through a gap in the back wall as Vernon's men kicked in the front door. The mine entrance was terrifyingly close to the searchers, but darkness and their focus on the buildings provided momentary cover. The shaft entrance smelled of damp earth and decay. Tansy led them inside, feeling her way along the rough-hewn walls. Behind them, shouts indicated their escape had been discovered. Torchlight flickered at the mine entrance. They went into the shaft. Someone yelled. Pike, they're in the mine. Tansy heard Vernon's voice, cold and final. Seal it. Bring timber from the buildings and collapse the entrance. If they want to hide in the mountain, let the mountain keep them. The sound of axes on wood echoed through the shaft. Men were following Vernon's order, and soon tons of rock and timber would come down, entombing them in darkness. Move deeper, Tansy ordered, urgency overriding caution. Before they bring it down, they stumbled into the black depths as behind them the mountain began to fall. The sound of the collapse was deafening, rock grinding against rock, timber splintering, the roar of earth settling into new configurations. Dust filled the shaft, choking and blinding them. The horses panicked, trying to rear in the confined space. Tansy held tight to Copper's reins, talking low and steady until the mare calmed. When the noise finally stopped, silence pressed in like a physical weight. Thomas struck a match, and by its brief flare they assessed their situation. The entrance was completely blocked, tons of rubble where the opening had been. They were sealed inside the mountain. We're going to die in here, Thomas said flatly. Not if there's another way out. Tansy used the last of their matches to light a small torch made from a broken piece of timber. By its light, they could see the shaft extending deeper into the mountain, rough walls glistening with moisture. All mines sometimes have multiple entrances, ventilation shafts, secondary tunnels, emergency exits. We find one of those, or we find where this shaft connects to natural caves. That's a lot of hope built on sometimes, Lona said, but she was already moving forward. Still better than sitting here waiting to suffocate. They led the horses deeper into the mine. The shaft descended at a gradual angle, the floor uneven and treacherous. Abandoned equipment littered the path, rusted pickaxes, broken ore carts, rotted timber supports. The mine had been deserted decades ago, judging by the decay. Water trickled down one wall, which Tansy took as a good sign. Water meant air circulation, and air meant somewhere this shaft connected to the outside. They followed the water's path, the torch burning lower with each step. "How much air do you think we have?" Thomas asked. "Enough to either find a way out or prove we can't," Tansy replied. "No point worrying about it either way." The shaft branched after about 200 yards. Tansy chose the path where air movement was strongest, trusting her instincts. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to lead the horses single file. In places, the ceiling dropped low enough that they had to crouch. Lona stopped suddenly. "Listen," they stood silent. Faintly, impossibly distant came the sound of running water. Not the trickle along the walls, but something larger. A river or strong creek flowing somewhere below them. "Rivers carve caves," Tansy said. "If this mine connected to a natural cave system, that water might be our way out." They pushed forward with renewed urgency. The torch was burning dangerously low, and once it went out, they'd be in absolute darkness. Tansy tried not to think about being trapped underground, with no light, no direction, no hope. The tunnel opened suddenly into a larger chamber, and their torch illuminated something unexpected. Fresh air movement, strong enough to make the flame flicker. On the far side of the chamber, a narrow crack in the rock showed darkness beyond, but with a quality different from the mine's oppressive black. It was the darkness of open space. "There," Tansy pointed. "That's our way out." The crack was barely wide enough for a person, let alone a horse. They'd have to leave their mounts behind, which meant leaving most of their supplies and moving on foot through unknown terrain. "I can't leave Copper," Tansy said, feeling foolish even as she said it. The mare had been James's horse originally, one of the last connections to her old life. "You have to," Lona said gently. "We all do. The horses have water here and probably enough air. We can send help back once we're out, if we get out," her expression added. Thomas was already removing the saddlebags containing the documents. "Take only what we absolutely need. Food, water, the papers. Everything else stays." They redistributed the supplies, fashioned crude packs, and approached the crack. Tansy went first, squeezing through the narrow passage. Rock scraped her back and chest, and for one terrifying moment she was wedged tight, unable to move forward or back. Then she pushed hard and popped through into the space beyond. The cave on the other side was massive, cathedral-like in its proportions. Their dying torch showed stalactites hanging from the ceiling and a river flowing through the center, exactly as they'd hoped. More importantly, far ahead, Tansy could see the faintest hint of grey. Not daylight exactly, but the promise of it. Dawn approaching, and with it, an exit. Lona and Thomas squeezed through after her. They stood on a natural ledge above the river, the sound of rushing water filling the chamber. A path of sorts wound along the cavern wall, probably carved by centuries of water during flood seasons. "We follow the river downstream," Tansy said. "It'll lead us out." They extinguished the torch, no point wasting it when they could see faint light ahead. In the dimness, they picked their way along the path, the river roaring beside them. Several times, the ledge disappeared completely, and they had to wade through icy water, holding the document bags above their heads. The grey light ahead grew stronger. Fresh air carried the scent of pine and morning dew. And finally, blessedly, they emerged from the mountain's mouth into the thin light of dawn. They were miles from where they'd entered, in a valley Tansy recognized from her guiding days. The territorial capital lay northeast, perhaps a day's hard walk. They had no horses, limited supplies, and Vernon Pike likely had men searching for them. But they were alive, and they had the documents. "Come on," Tansy said, already moving. "We've got a deadline to meet." They walked through the day and into the next night, driven by urgency and the knowledge that every hour mattered. Thomas proved surprisingly resilient despite his youth, keeping pace without complaint. Lona's determination never wavered, even when exhaustion made each step a small victory. Tansy pushed them harder than was probably wise, but Marshal Grant's office was their only chance. If Vernon completed his railroad deal before they could present evidence, the conspiracy would be buried under corporate protection and legal complexity. Speed was their only weapon now. They reached the territorial capital at mid-morning of the second day, staggering through streets that seemed impossibly clean and ordered after the wilderness. The marshal's office occupied a stolid brick building near the courthouse, identified by a painted sign and an American flag. Marshal Samuel Grant was exactly as Tansy remembered, gray-haired now, but still carrying the bearing of a man who'd spent years enforcing law in difficult places. He looked up from his desk as they stumbled in, and recognition dawned immediately. Tansy Quill, I'll be damned. He stood, concern replacing surprise. You look like you've been through hell. Close enough. Tansy set the document bag on his desk. I need you to look at something. All of it carefully. And I need you to act on it today. Grant opened the bag and began examining the contents. His expression grew darker with each document. When he reached James's letter and the photograph, he looked up at Tansy with something like pity. This is comprehensive, he said quietly. If it's all genuine, it proves systematic land fraud going back more than a decade. Vernon Pike, courthouse officials, even the Territorial Land Commissioner. He set down the photograph. And James, I'm sorry, Tansy, I know what he meant to you. I know what I thought he meant. Truth turns out to be more complicated. Tansy sat heavily in a chair. Can you use it? Can you stop Pike before he legitimizes everything through his railroad deal? Grant studied the documents again, this time with a lawman's eye for evidence. The ledger page showing bribes is compelling. The forged deeds establish pattern. The correspondence proves conspiracy. He looked at Thomas. You worked for Pike? Yes, sir. I witnessed much of what those documents describe. I'll testify to everything I saw and heard. That helps. Eyewitness testimony combined with documentary evidence, that's enough for warrants. Grant was already reaching for paper and pen. I'll need sworn statements from all of you. Then I'm riding to Pike's operation, with deputies and federal authority. If he resists, he'll resist, Tansy said. He has armed men and nothing to lose now. Then we'll be prepared for that. Grant began writing rapidly. The railroad deal, when does it finalize? Today, if it hasn't already, Thomas said. They were discussing terms 2 days ago, Grant swore under his breath and wrote faster. Then we move immediately. No time for extensive preparation, but federal marshals have authority over territorial officials. I can arrest the commissioner if necessary, freeze any pending land transactions. He looked up. This won't be clean or easy. Pike has resources and friends, but with this evidence, we have grounds to act. The next hours passed in controlled chaos. Grant summoned deputies, sent telegrams, prepared warrants. Tansy, Lona, and Thomas gave detailed statements, describing everything they'd witnessed and experienced. A federal judge reviewed the documents and granted arrest warrants for Vernon Pike, the Territorial Land Commissioner, and several courthouse officials. By afternoon, Grant was leading a posse of 12 men back toward the mountains. He'd insisted Tansy stay in town. You've done your part, and you've been through enough, but she'd refused. This needed to end with her present. Grant had finally agreed, on condition she let his men handle any confrontation. They arrived at Pike's operation at dusk. The place seemed subdued, men working quietly or standing idle. Grant's deputies surrounded the camp, while the marshal approached the main lodge with warrants in hand. Vernon Pike emerged before Grant could knock, as if he'd been expecting this. His face was haggard, and he'd aged years in the 2 days since Tansy had last seen him. Marshal Grant, Vernon said flatly. I assume this is about recent allegations. Vernon Pike, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and bribery of territorial officials. You'll come with me peacefully or we'll take you by force. Vernon's shoulders sagged. Some of the fight seemed to have left him. The railroad deal? Suspended pending investigation. The commissioner is also under arrest. The entire transaction is voided until the courts determine the legitimacy of your land claims. Vernon looked past Grant to where Tansy sat on her borrowed horse. Their eyes met, and something like understanding passed between them. He'd lost, and he knew it. The empire he'd built through deception was crumbling. "I'll come peacefully," he said quietly. "But I want it noted that James Quill was part of this from the beginning. Whatever else happens, that truth should be acknowledged." "It will be," Tansy said, speaking for the first time. "All of it. His crimes, his belated conscience, his death." "The whole truth," Vernon nodded slowly, and allowed himself to be placed in custody. Other deputies began arresting his men, though most offered no resistance. Without Pike's leadership, the organization fell apart like a house built on sand. The ride back to the capital took 2 days. Vernon Pike remained silent throughout, wrapped in whatever thoughts occupy men who've lost everything they spent years building. The territorial commissioner, arrested separately, tried repeatedly to distance himself from the conspiracy, but the documents told a clear story. Legal proceedings stretched across months. 17 families had their lands restored through court order. Some, like the Hendersons, returned immediately to rebuild. Others had scattered too far to reclaim what they'd lost. But they received compensation from Pike's assets. Lona Wirth stood on her family's property on a cool morning in autumn, watching workers rebuild the cabin Vernon's men had burned. Her brother Danny had come from 3 counties over, and together they were restoring what their father had built. "You could stay," Lona said to Tansy, who'd ridden up to check on the progress. "There's more than enough land, and you know these mountains better than anyone." Tansy smiled but shook her head. "This is your land, your future. You've earned it, and you'll make something good here." She looked toward the high peaks where morning sun painted snow-covered summits. "I've got my own peace to make with these mountains. What will you do? Return to the high country? Do some guiding again, maybe? Or just live quiet and let the past finally settle where it belongs?" Tansy gathered her reins. "But I'll visit. Make sure you and Danny are doing all right." Thomas had found work with the territorial government, his testimony having impressed Marshal Grant enough to recommend him for a position. Vernon Pike sat in territorial prison awaiting trial, his empire dismantled, his name synonymous with corruption. The land commissioner had resigned in disgrace, and reforms were being discussed to prevent similar schemes. Tansy rode back toward the highlands, James's rifle across her saddle. She carried his memory differently now, not as a perfect martyr, but as a flawed man who'd tried at the end to make amends. It was a smaller, more complicated truth than the one she'd believed for 15 years. But it was honest. At the old campsite where she'd found the carved bird, she built a small cairn of stones. Not a monument, just a marker acknowledging what had been and what was lost. She placed the wooden bird on top and stood for a long moment, saying goodbye to the young woman who'd loved James Quill and to the man himself, with all his virtues and failures. Then she mounted Copper and rode deeper into the mountains toward whatever came next. The past was settled, the future was uncertain, and for the first time in 15 years, Tansy Quill felt ready to face both. The mountains embraced her as they always had, vast and indifferent and home.